Good evening. Welcome to our class, Connecting the Dots. Tonight, we're going to summarize our class and wind it down by looking at the last part of Romans chapter 8, which is all about suffering. You know, there's one thing that Paul knows for sure. Personally, he knew it, but he also was inspired by the Spirit to write about it. The one thing that will cause us to doubt the truth about who we really are, especially the truth about our security and our significance in Christ, and that is personal suffering. That's the one thing that gets everybody. The one thing that our enemies use to hurt us the most and to get us to doubt the truth about who we really are. And so Paul devotes the entire last half of Romans chapter 8 to a discussion of suffering. Now, I know that this isn't really a pleasant conversation, I know, to have, or a pleasant study to do, especially right here at the holidays, but have you noticed how many people are suffering during the holiday season? The holiday season are anything but joyous for multitudes of folks out there. Now, remind ourselves, there are plenty of people around us, and I don't know the reason for that. I suspect it has a lot to do with higher expectations that each of us have for the holidays. I'm not sure exactly why, but it just seems like the suffering's more intense during the holiday season. And so I think this last class that we're doing as we wrap up our study is an appropriate class, especially at this time of year. And that is the concept of suffering. Now, Paul closes the one section, the first half of his letter, on a glorious note by telling us in verse 17 that we are heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. But in the middle of that verse, he throws a little bit of a caveat in there that causes us to pause for a moment in our thinking. He says, if so be that we suffer with him. In other words, we're going to be glorified together with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him. Now, Paul, I want to tell him that he was on such a roll. I mean, when you're going into Romans 8, and talking about the provisions that God gives us, the fact that there's no condemnation for us when we're struggling in our recovery, when we're trying to fight the flesh, when we are trying to do what's right, but we can't do what's right, and we have that internal conflict. He says there's no condemnation to you. Then he goes on to say, listen, you've got a brand new mind, the mind of Christ. You can actually think like Jesus thinks. And then the greatest provision of all is you have the Spirit of Christ living in you. And that same Spirit that raised up Jesus from the dead is living in you and will literally cause this mortal, sin-cursed body of ours to come alive with the life of Christ. I mean, you talk about a role, and then he goes on to tell us that we're continually being led by the Spirit, and we've not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but the spirit of adoption. We have been adopted into God's family, and that his Spirit's constantly bearing witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Last week, we talked about ways we hear God personally, how each of us can listen to his voice, speak assurance to us, to actually hear him say to us, you are my beloved child in whom I'm well pleased. I was talking with a lady last night that in prayer she heard God say to her, you are precious. I mean, it's an astounding thing when God speaks to you. And so Paul is really on a roll here, but then all of a sudden he starts talking about if we suffer with Christ. And he goes on in the next verse, in verse 18, to tell us not only if so be we suffer with him, he goes on to say, listen, I count on the fact that the sufferings of this present time, no matter what they are, the sufferings of this present time that we live in are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. In other words, he says there's no amount of suffering that can outdo the glory of God. But he introduces a subject of suffering specifically because he knows that when we enter into a period of suffering, no matter what it's from, a period of crisis in our lives, of one sort or another, whether it be relational or whether it be physical, we enter into that suffering. We all naturally have a tendency to lose sight of the gospel we've been studying, the good news of who God made us to be, and the personal benefits of that good news. That is, we lose sight of the fact that we are loved, accepted, and forgiven. We lose sight of the fact that our lives are meaningful. We have meaning and purpose in our lives, that we are important and that we are adequate. In other words, our personal needs are seriously threatened when times of suffering. And so it's necessary that we talk about how to deal with that. And that's exactly what Paul does in the latter half of Romans chapter 8. Now, obviously, in the time that I have here this evening, I don't have time to go through a full exposition of Romans chapter 8 with all of you, but I do want you to understand the highlights. To begin with, he asks the fundamental question that all of us ask when we encounter any type of suffering, and that is, why does this happen to me? Why did I have to go through this? Why in the world did God let me do this? Or did God let this happen to me? In other words, he brings up the subject of why. And as you all know, we are all guilty of trying to find fault or to blame either ourselves or someone else or God, as if blaming somebody would really help. It never really has helped me in my suffering. Even if I could blame somebody, it doesn't really help me. I'm still suffering. But he knows we're going to do that. So he kind of beats us to the punch here in these next few verses. He explains why we suffer. Essentially, it boils down to this. You are living in a sin-cursed world that is falling apart at the seams. Physicists call that the second law of thermodynamics. Matter goes from an orderly state to a disorderly state. Things grow old and fall apart. Everything does. And when they fall apart, it causes suffering. My wife and I have had a fall apart week this week. First of all, a refrigerator fell apart. So we have to get a new refrigerator. Now I learned tonight, right before class, that our dryer fell apart. We're going to have to get a new dryer. I mean, things naturally grow old and fall apart. And when they do, that causes us some degree of suffering. Well, Paul says we live in a creation that groans and travails together in pain until now because things grow old and fall apart in this world we're living in. But not only that, he also goes on to say that we suffer because we ourselves, even we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we also groan within ourselves. Why? Because we're falling apart. Every one of us are falling apart physically. Our bodies are falling apart. That's called the aging process, and it's going to end in death for all of us. Now, because we live in a sin-cursed world and sin-cursed bodies, both of which are growing old and falling apart, in addition, we live with people, other people in sin-cursed bodies that are growing old and falling apart. So to summarize it, and I'll try to clean it up a little bit, that bumper sticker you may have seen at one time or another that says simply, stuff happens. I'll make that biblical for you. Dung happens. Things grow old and fall apart. That's why you suffer. Now, it's important for us to note that what Paul didn't say here, he didn't say you suffer because you're not smart enough. You suffer because you don't have enough faith. You suffer because you're not spiritual enough. You suffer because there's some other inadequacy in you. No. He lays no blame on a personal level here for our suffering. He simply says we all are going to have to face that suffering. Then he explains in a little kind of a hard to understand passage here when he says, we were saved and are saved in the realm of hope. When he says we're saved by hope, he's talking about we're saved in the realm of hope, but hope that is seen is not hope for, or is not hope, for why does a man yet wait for it? In other words, what he's saying is the glory that's going to be revealed in us is not yet obtained. As good as this world is, it's not yet what God has planned for us. He has got things we can't imagine planned for us, good things that is our hope, is our glory to come. But he says, if we're saved in this realm of hope, then do we with patience wait for it. Now, what he means by that, he gives us a little clue here that he's talking about endurance. You see, one of the neatest things of God's provisions for us in times of suffering is that he has promised that he will not allow anything to come into your life that you cannot endure. Now, I know that anything comes into my life causes me suffering. Immediately I get the idea, I can't take this. Really, what I'm saying is, I don't want to take this. But the truth is, I can take it. Why? Because he's given me that endurance. And so in that endurance, we wait for God's deliverance in this present world of suffering. And deliverance is there. He promises that it's there. He tells us in the verses that follow that the Spirit immediately begins to make intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. As soon as we enter into suffering, he not only gives us endurance to take it, but he also begins to make intercession for us. The Spirit is groaning within us, praying on our behalf and for us. And then that famous verse in Romans 8 that many people can quote, hardly anybody can believe, Romans 8:28, it says, for we know that all things, even our suffering, all things work together for good to them that love God, who are called according to his purpose. You see, even the bad stuff that's happening to us, God uses to our advantage. Even the bad stuff, he turns for our good. And then he gives us 5 separate verbs here to tell us what God has already done for us to assure us that we can't lose. He said he predestined you. He marked out your horizon. He predestined you. He foreknew you. That is, he set his heart upon you. He called you. He justified you. And he glorified you. Those are all written, let me get technical just for a moment. Those are all written in the Greek in what's called the aorist tense, which means it's a done deal. Once and for all, he foreknew you. Once and for all, he predestined you. Once and for all, he called you. Once and for all, he justified you. And once and for all, he glorified you. As far as God is concerned, there's no way for you to lose. And so Paul goes on to ask this simple question. Well, what should we say then to these things? Unfortunately, our answer very often is, well, I don't really care about these things because, you see, I'm hurting. I need something else. But really, what he means for us and what he implies for us to understand is, as God is for us. In fact, he goes on to say that. If God be for us, who can be against us? Who's going to condemn you when God has justified you? Who is going to lay anything to your charge when it is Christ who died for you, has risen again to justify you, declare you righteous, and freely give you all things? In other words, because God is for you, there's no way you can lose, even in the midst of suffering. Now, that's when we need to believe it the most, is when we suffer. It's easy to believe I'm not losing when things are going well. It's easy for me to believe that I'm okay. I am loved of God. I'm secure in his love and significant in his plan when everything in my life is going well. When my dryer doesn't break, my refrigerator doesn't go out in the same week. It's easy for me to believe that, oh, yeah, God's for me. But when that suffering hits, that's when I question. That's when I begin to doubt. Now, in order to help you with that, I'm going to close out my portion of this and bring the panel in by talking just briefly about what I call the eternal view of suffering. The eternal view is God's view, how God sees suffering. And it's revealed to us everywhere in the scripture. I'm not going to take the time now to point out various passages to you, but let me just give you the three main points. Number one, don't be surprised when you suffer. Don't play this little game that you've entered into recovery now and you're being a good Christian, and so everything ought to be hunky-dory. God doesn't play that game with you. Don't promise him, God, I'm going to be a good Christian. I'm going to go to church and I'm going to behave myself. I'm going to not drink or drug, and you bless me, okay? God doesn't play that game. Listen, there was nobody that behaved himself more than Jesus, and yet nobody suffered more than him. Suffering is part and parcel of our life with him. It's not that we need to avoid it. It's we need to learn to go through it. So don't be surprised when you suffer. The second and probably most important point is for you to be able to see the end of your suffering at the beginning. That's the eternal view. See, God knows how everything's going to work out. He knows how he's planned everything to work out in your life. He knows how he's going to use everything for your good already. And he's revealed that to us in various scriptures. That's why James, for instance, tells us to count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Now, either James is a lunatic or he knows something we don't know. And what he knows that we don't know is that God knows what's best. He knows what's best for you and promises to work everything out for your good. And so seeing the end at the beginning is the recognition by faith, and it is by faith, through the eyes of faith, we can actually see we're not going to lose. And that brings me to the third and final point. Know of a surety that you cannot possibly lose, because you are joined inseparably to Christ, because you are one with him. Though you might suffer like he does, though you might experience the pain and agony somewhat like he did, you are not going to lose. Even though it looked like Jesus was losing when he hung on the cross, remember, 3 days later, he rose again from the grave. You shall not lose. You cannot lose, no matter what the suffering. And so Paul closes out this chapter in what I consider to be one of the most glorious passages in all the New Testament by asking us this question: what shall separate us from the love of God? And he goes through a whole list of sufferings, so tribulation or distress or persecution. He says nothing, no created thing, including ourselves, shall be able to separate us from the love of God. There is no possible way for us to lose. And so now I'm going to bring our panel in to discuss this with you tonight. The subject of suffering is one that people have talked about. All the pundits, all the theologians, all psychologists, all that, they've all talked about suffering in one way or another. And I certainly haven't done the subject justice this evening in this little brief overview, but I want to have our panel share their take on this whole idea of suffering and what God is doing for us in the midst of it. First of all, let's start with Bill. Bill, you've had a particularly bad year of suffering, not just talking about COVID here at all. So I consider you to be a resident expert on suffering. Share with us your take on it.
Yeah, it's really interesting listening to you to review that. I remember the first time, when you become a Christian, that idea comes and you'll hear it in church, you'll hear it. And theologians have talked about the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? Why do we suffer? And I don't know if we can ever adequately answer the origins. What I do know, in fact, there's not really any answer as to the why, except that we are in the sin-cursed world in these sin-cursed bodies. But I do know that God will sit with us in our suffering. He'll sit with us in the darkness, in the hole of despair, until we're ready to let his light come in. And I remember when I first heard John teach in the Alpha series, this was something so practical that we could, it was like, okay, what does faith in the midst of suffering look like? And the scriptures were there that don't be surprised, know the end at the beginning, and know that you can't lose, and that the Holy Spirit is our provision, is our comforter. And after going through the Alpha series 3 or 4 times, my life fell apart. I went through some real suffering, and my marriage fell apart. And I remember walking. I would go out walking, and with anxiety and going through the steps, like, okay, I'm in this loveless marriage with this person, and I'm codependent. And to me, it was like there was no way out. And this is what it's going to be. And it fell apart. I mean, God set me free from all of that. But I remember knowing, putting faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and knowing that in the end, so all right, so this is me for the next 50 years. That's a sneeze in the light of eternity. I'm going to be going around saying, hey, Pam, hey, John, hey, Tom, hey, Dave, I haven't seen you in 1 billion years. How's your mansion? Oh yeah, that's good, right? I mean, you think, and I remember thinking about my sister's wedding. I went to my sister's wedding in the midst of all that, and seeing all of my relatives who haven't seen each other in a long time, just the joy. And I thought, that's going to be played over and over again in heaven. So I got a lot of relief. And then I began working with Alpha Ministries more and more, and began teaching the Alpha series. I taught the Alpha series for almost 20 years, and taught on the eternal view of suffering for 20 years, having our own little sufferings here and there. And then in 2019, Liam, my son Liam, took his life, and nothing can prepare you for that. And you could know the end at the beginning, know you can't lose, throw it out the window. Like nothing made sense to me at all. And it wasn't that it's hard to explain. And I remember that, the numb, the shock, but everything gets shaken. And even though you know it and you've taught it, nothing prepares you, and you're suffering. And, John was key, because I'd go see John every week, and I wasn't really getting much relief. But here's what happened. One morning, it was 3 months into it. Grace and I were driving to school together, and I said out loud, I said, all right, know the end at the beginning. Know that God works all things together. And I started going through the eternal view of suffering in my mind and talking about it. And I would do that for the next 3 days on the way to school. And I began to get some relief. Now, tying this all together, what we talked about a couple weeks ago, hearing that still small voice, hearing God speak to me. I remember just wailing and crying out to God and saying, I didn't want Liam to die, Lord. I didn't want him to go away from me like that. I didn't want him to die. And then I said, I didn't want him to die. And I heard God say, neither did I. That's why I gave him eternal life. and immediately you feel that supernatural comfort when God speaks to you like that. And then it dawned on me, he was revealing to me, we put even Christianity becomes this law thing that, okay, now that I've received Jesus, I can really get my act together and nothing bad will happen. I mean, I didn't have my act together because I didn't have Jesus back then, but now I have him, and there's no excuse. I should have my act together, should have been on top of this. Liam should be alive, that type of thing. And Jesus said, listen, son, I didn't come light years across the universe to suffer and die so that you all could get your act together and bad shit wouldn't happen in this world. I came light years across the universe and suffered and died because this stuff happens, because sin and death, because you can't save yourself. And that word, that personal word, brought so much relief, so much joy mixed with this sadness. And I would go through, know the end at the beginning. And for me, what I picture when I'm down is me running up to Liam and saying, Liam, it's you. It's really you. Grabbing him by the shoulders. And Jesus is right there, smiling from ear to ear, because that's why he did it, right? The suffering, sin and death. I mean, death is the ultimate suffering, that separation from our loved ones. That we all, I mean, it happens. I lost one of my best friends back in October. And it's 100%. It's 100% rate. And then nothing hit me more. When I was working out at the gym and I was just missing Liam and feeling like really bad. And I heard God say, you have no idea what I have in store for the two of you. It's not over. Your story with your son isn't over. You have no idea. And I thought, nah, that can't be God, right? Because it's too beautiful. It's too wonderful, right? If God's condemning us, man, that's his voice. Yeah, he's all over that. That's certainly him. But when we hear things that are good and true and beautiful and that wonderful, that can't be God. But it is. I'm taking God at his word. So the eternal view is really something that is so practical, so hands-on. Know the end at the beginning, right? It's whatever it is, whatever you're in that you think's never going to end, it's going to end, right? So put it in the light of eternity. And our present sufferings are not worth the revealing the glory that we are going to be with God forever and ever in unconditional love in eternity. So put your next, I'm 58, put your next 30, 40 years. You might even be older, whatever it is, you just put a number on it and put that in the light of 1 billion years, or in the light, like it's not even that there's time in heaven, but that's the only way we can measure it. 1 trillion years, 1 billion. Right? And that scene that you would see at a wedding, people haven't seen each other in a while, and they do like each other, just hugging and embracing over and over and over again, being played out. Know the end at the beginning and know that you can't lose. There's no pit of despair that God's not there in the pits with you. And he'll stay until you're ready to let the light in. Thank you, John.
For that testimony, Bill. I appreciate that. I know that it's real. It's real for you. There's no faking at all in that. Tom, let's go to you. You're regarding your take on the suffering, God's provisions.
Thank you. Couple things that come to mind. First thing, kind of humorous, is if suffering can be humorous. You mentioned a bumper sticker that dung happens. It brings to mind another bumper sticker that I'm fond of. It goes like this. It says, honk if parts fall off, which I can definitely relate to. I keep getting these new parts put into my body. I'm going to get some new parts again next week. So I told my wife, is when I'm done with this body, what you can do is have it cremated and then collect up all the titanium and stainless steel, and you can probably make a fortune at the scrapyard just getting that stuff all reclaimed. But fortunately, they have the technology to put some new parts in me. But yeah, it's another way of saying that we get old, we die, and as you said, the law of thermodynamics definitely is in play, that things keep falling apart. And that is a lot of why we do suffer. I think one thing that's really important point that needs to be made, particularly regarding suffering for the believer, is that we must not connect suffering to performance. In the wisdom of this world will tell you whether the reason that you're suffering is because of the choices that you made and the things that you've done, and they lead to suffering. And there is some truth to that, but my warning is not always. There are a lot of people that do everything wrong and get away with it. And there's other people that do everything right and they suffer anyways. The biblical concept is that the Lord causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike, which means that people that need rain don't always get it, and the people that get it maybe don't deserve it. Likewise, some people get too much rain and it floods them out. But when it rains, it falls on the just and the unjust alike. So we really need to avoid that dangerous idea of connecting suffering to our own personal performance, because then we're always trying to find somebody to blame, and we start playing the blame game, and we either blame ourselves or we blame somebody else, and there's no escape from that trap. That's a bad rabbit trail to run down. So don't do it. You'll end up kind of like Job. His buddies came around to comfort him, and all they were really concerned about is what Job had done to mess up that warranted the suffering that was going on in his life. And there was no comfort in that whatsoever for Job. It just made Job, it made the suffering worse. And finally, what kind of a dot that connected for me, John, as you were talking about Romans 8:24 and 25, and I'll just read it real quick. For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for it? But if we hope for that which we see not, then we do with patience wait for it. And it connected to me to that famous chapter in Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 11, the what's often known as the heroes of faith chapter, and it goes through. It's like a whirlwind tour through the Old Testament scriptures, talking about the various characters in the Old Testament and how they suffered mightily, yet God had made promises to them, and what got them through the suffering and what they were commended for, what they're remembered for, is that they learned to live in the realm of hope. And it said that something to the effect that they, if I can recall, they all died not having received yet the promise, but they were living in the realm of hope, and they looked forward to what the writer called a better country, a heavenly country. They realized that they were citizens of heaven, and they were citizens of this earth as well, but they were citizens of heaven. So their citizenship on earth was temporary, yet their heavenly citizenship was permanent. It was eternal, and that is what empowered them to live in the realm of hope. And it was that hope that allowed them to keep on keeping on and move through the suffering. And that's another important thing is, it's like, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The important word, I think, there is through. That we're going to go through it. We're not gonna be stuck there and have to live there. We're gonna move through it, through that valley of the shadow of death. So I'll quit on that and rest my case there.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. David, let's jump to you real quick. I'm going to give you as much time as possible to share your testimony of suffering and hope.
All right. Well, thank you. Suffering. Now, coming from my background, it's been a struggle, as Tom just put very clearly, coming from alcohol and drugs and what I did to destroy relationships, the people I hurt, my own daughters, my wives, plural. And that was in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. As after we do the 9th step, there's what they call the 9th step promises. And in that, it says we will not regret the past or wish to shut the door on it. Working through the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, helped me to get past that suffering that was, I use the term that I have caused it. But since working through that and then coming into an identity through the Alpha series, through who we are in Christ, I have a little different perspective on that today, through the activities of life that I live now. And I break it into several categories. Number one, there's a financial suffering that I go through. There's a relational suffering. And then there's the getting old and body falling apart suffering. And in those categories, I tell my wife every now and then, when it comes to relational or physical suffering or financial suffering either, that God hasn't brought us this far to drop us on our head. In other words, like Bill was saying, having an internal view of the fact that we're going to get through this, that you see the end from the beginning. Now, that's not just an intellectual vision of that, but it's a spirit enlightened, which is what I've been able to receive from him, to be able to see that everything has a season, and that as long as I walk in faith, and even though I'm suffering, he's given me the ability, which is profound to me, to be able to trust him and to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, whatever relational or financial or physical barriers that I've come across. And so that ability to do that is something that he does in us, and has been doing that in my life, which is profound. But again, coming from severe alcohol and drug addiction, doing a lot of damage to relationships, to financial, to my own body, to get through that guilt, shame, and stuff took some time. And I still get some waves of it, even tonight when we're sitting here talking. I still have some pain associated with people and relationships I hurt back in the day, but which it's hard, like Tom said, to divide that out. So I'm just being perfectly frank, and this is my experience. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So then I think the one thing that all of us can share along this line is the suffering is very individual, it's very personal, and it's not something that's just automatically going to go away until we get that new body, until we are in glory, until we don't have this sin-cursed world around us anymore. So appreciate your testimony there, David. Pam, let's go to you.
Thank you. Good evening. As I was trying to think about how to connect this, the passage in the big book that I thought of first was on page 15. And on page 15, it says that we would not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead if we did not work. That we would surely drink again, and if we drank again, we would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. With us, it was just like that. And Bill goes on to talk about having made many fast friends, and what he calls the joy of living. And I've heard, John, I've heard you talk about, I don't know how you put it exactly, but that a synonym for hope is joy, or joy is hope. And that's kind of what Bill describes here in his story. He talks about that because of the friendships and the fellowship that he had, he said the joy of living that we really have even under pressure and difficulty. And then he goes on to describe an entire litany of problems and suffering that he's has seen over time resolve itself. He says there is scarcely any form of trouble or misery which has not been overcome among us. And I had to laugh when you first said that the topic would be suffering. I tried for years when I would chair meetings, because this is one of my favorite topics, is what I call in my world suffering in sobriety. And that I would chair a meeting and I would make that the topic, and I would get like 2 people out of the whole room that raise their hands. I mean, I quit making it the topic because you couldn't get any kind of response or follow up on that out of the group. And I think as I was looking at it this evening, one of the reasons that that is true is because in the program it connects getting through suffering with the action of service to other people. That it is when we are involved with other people and when we are in service to other people that we are the most successful at getting through our own suffering. First of all, of course, because it helps us take the focus off of us. I know we've all had the experience many times of being focused on some sort of pain, and then we get distracted and all of a sudden it's not so bearable because we've quit focusing on it. And the big book really stresses the importance of service. Just to round this evening out, I want to go back and touch on this Breathing Underwater book, because it still is one of my absolute most favorites. And in Breathing Underwater, Richard Rohr is talking about suffering, and he said, I am saying that only people who have suffered in some way can help others, exactly as the 12-step program discovered. Deep communion and dear compassion is formed much more by shared pain than by shared pleasure. And that is one of my richest, deepest truths that God's been ministering into my life for the last couple of years, is what Richard Rohr calls dualistic thinking. This obsession that I have with deciding what's right and what's wrong, what is good and what's bad. And Richard goes on to talk about, he cites Jesus, and Jesus said to Peter, he says it's in Luke, Peter, you must be ground like wheat, and once you have recovered, then you can turn and help others. Jesus says this to Peter, and this was Peter's real ordination into ministry. So Joyce Meyer always says everybody wants a testimony, but nobody wants a test. And when I'm in the middle of something, even though it doesn't make it go away, to recognize that everything that God sees me through becomes one more place that I can minister to other people. I have a precious, precious friend who's probably watching this evening, who had the same amount of sobriety that I had, and she relapsed. And that was very, very hard for her. But now she has, and she's back in the program over 5 years, I believe. Now she has an entire level of compassion, of ministry, of understanding that I don't have. And there is no other way to get it. I don't think deeper ministry is going to make anybody, especially me, go sign up for suffering. But when it does happen, to recognize that in God's economy, what feels like suffering and is hard for us is God's way of redeeming a sin-cursed world until he comes back and puts an end to all of it. Thanks.
I appreciate that. And, we were talking, Bill and I were talking before we came on the air tonight. And I told him, announced the topic that we were going to close out our class, connecting the dots on the note of suffering here out of Romans chapter 8. And I could almost hear him groan.
Yeah.
But immediately, we both confirmed it in ourselves that, that's on the other side of that groaning. The other side of that suffering is comfort, real comfort that God gives us in our times of suffering, precisely so that we can share it with other people. And I appreciate your bringing that point out, that it is one person's suffering helping another who is suffering. That's what it's all about. And that's the life of Christ. I mean, when you think, that's the reason Jesus came and suffered. He suffered and died for us to help us and to save us. And we're just following in his footsteps with that. I mentioned earlier that this will be the last broadcast for this class this evening. I want to take a special time here to thank David and Tom and Bill and Pam as panel members. They've helped me immensely during this time and have added amazing insight and made our class really a rich class. So I want to thank you guys for that. And I don't have a class in mind right at this moment. I'm going to close out the year here and see what God has in mind for the first of the year, but we'll get back with you. You all we'll keep you posted on our Facebook account here and YouTube. I'll be announcing it from the services. We will continue our live broadcasts on Sunday services, so stay tuned and we'll be back with you. I hope and I trust that this series has helped you all as you are striving for your own recovery. All right, Bill, I'm going to let you close us out tonight.
Likewise, John, we appreciate you so much for everything that you continue to teach and persevere and mentor us as well. We appreciate that. And, for the folks that are out there and they say that the holidays, seem worse, the thing about it is that there's no way around it. It's not if you're going to suffer, if you can get out of it, it's when we suffer, because we're all, if you love somebody and that's the price of loving, when you love others, and there's loss. And like John was saying, his washing machine or his refrigerator or whatever, our washing machine was busted the other night. I actually went in and cleared out the filter. It was the filter actually that was clogged with lots of interesting things that I leave in my pockets. So it was my fault that we were suffering without a washing machine. But the little things, the big things, whatever it is, it's personal. And Dave Kessler said in his book, whose grief is the worst? It's your grief. It's yours. And that pain, and I always said this before, my period of intense suffering, and I still believe it after, that if God left us in the dark, if he created us and there was this sin and death that entered the world, and he left us in the dark about the worst thing that we're going to face, which is death, separation of a loved one. If he was to leave us in the dark, that would be so cruel of him. But he hasn't left us in the dark about it at all. His promises are tried and true. And it's those things. It's his presence with us. It's him living with us and sitting sitting in the wound with you, sitting in the suffering. He's there all the time. And hope is a tricky thing. We talked about hope because I have that hope in my heart of reunion. But sometimes you think that they might walk through the door any minute, and they're just not. They're gone until it's your time to go home. So again, thank you, John, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We will be in touch on Facebook and our social media pages. Tammy, Jessica, Linda. We say amen. Kadar. One day it'll all be gone. Pam. My dad checked in. That's my dad. That's not me. He's actually, my grandfather was senior. My dad's junior. I'm the third. My dad checked in from New Jersey. And Grandma. So we're going to be in touch through Facebook, through YouTube, our social media pages. John will announce it. What we're going to be doing in the new year. We're going to wrap things up this Thursday. I'm going to do something a little Christmassy this Thursday for the spiritual warfare. And then the next Thursday is Christmas. The next Thursday is New Year. So we will see you after the new year in 2021. And, I think we've all gone through some collective suffering in 2020. We don't know if 2021 is going to be better. We don't know. But we do know that God works all things together for the good. And we do know that he'll never leave us nor forsake us. And we do know that if God is for us, who can be against us? So just be watching out on the page for announcements and things. 11 a.m., Freedom Ranch is open this Saturday. If you have an acoustic instrument, you want to go out to Freedom Ranch at 3 to jam out, play some music. That's at 3 p.m. at Freedom Ranch. Reach Community will be at the Causeway at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. at Freedom Ranch. Other than that, thanks, guys. This has been great. It's been life-giving to me. I love you guys and appreciate you. Thank you, everyone. Good night.